Thank you guys so much for joining us today for week 3. I'm starting to see very familiar faces, which is wonderful. And I'm hoping that you are finding this to be an encouraging time and a helpful time to you in your development for fall. Today we're going to be focused in on assessing our students. And like last week, we introduced one new tool or technique that you could use in your classrooms by using the shared Google document. We're going to use that strategy again today, but I'm also going to kind of model for you how we can use the chat feature in Zoom itself to facilitate some conversations as we go through. So we're going to start with a welcome question, and it's just kind of an icebreaker, but also as a way to quickly get information from the people who are here. So in the chat, if you would just type in one worry or question or comment or concern that you have about assessing student learning in this modified face-to-face format, that would be awesome. So find the chat wherever it might be for you, and go ahead and type in. Make sure that it says to everyone, because you get an opportunity to privately chat or chat with the hosts. So that's good. Good. So I'm seeing folks talk about integrity, so keeping a test secure and test cheating, looking at test cheating resources like Chegg, information sharing, open notes, accessible resources that just come with moving to an online format. And so we're going to address some of these today, and hopefully in your breakout sessions, you'll be able to dialogue a little bit more closely with some of this information, as well as we think about how to design assessments for a modified face-to-face environment. So our goals today are really to explore some assessment options that are effective for modified face-to-face instruction that not only address some of the challenges that you all raised, but that also overcome or free us from some of those limitations, and then to discuss assessment with our colleagues and get some ideas and brainstorm with one another together. So we'll start with just a simple definition of assessment, which is that assessment is the systematic collection and analysis of information that's designed to improve student learning. So the whole goal of assessment is really to drive or foster student learning. And the how of assessment is really about intentional collection and analysis of information. And the key word that I want to hone in on for us is intentional. So it's something that we think about a priori. It's something that we address in the design of the course so that we can collect and analyze the most robust set of information or data, if you come from a science bent, about your students and their learning in the context of your course. Most of us think about assessment as kind of a test or an exam, but we also have a lot of assessment that we do on a more regular and reoccurring basis, which we would call formative assessment. We're going to talk about that level of assessment next week. So today we're going to more focus on the big summative kind of assessments that you would use to analyze and improve student learning, like say after the end of a unit, for example. So to talk about assessment, we really want to think in terms of a triangle. And I like to call this the alignment triangle. Sometimes it goes by other names, but the goal here is to have the 3 points of the triangle aligned with one another. So we start our course design with our learning outcomes, which are just simply statements that articulate our learning goals for our students. And we want those to align with the assessment that we give to our students and allow them to demonstrate their knowledge. And so we're going to start by having you reflect over one of your courses and one particular learning objective that you have for one of your courses. It might take you a minute to either pull it up from a class session or a syllabus or to think about it, but I'd love for you to write out that learning objective in the chat once you can find it.
And again, once you are able to find one of those learning objectives, if you could dump that into the chat so we could be able to read that, that would be great.
I'll stick an example in there from one of my classes. I had the advantage of thinking about it ahead of time. So as you're ready, you can add yours into the chat as well. Good, about another minute or so. You can take a peek at these. I'm seeing, I think most of these, based on what I'm reading, are probably from the syllabus. You guys nod your head. Are these from syllabi examples? Yes, yeah. Based on what I'm seeing, they seem to be fairly high level objectives. Demonstrate understanding, develop critical financial modeling and analysis skills, develop skills in scientific reasoning and problem solving, listen and communicate with clarity, compare and contrast, ionic and covalent bonding, demonstrating ability to analyze and adjust to management challenges in an organization, reflect on diverse contributions made from researchers in the field of cognitive psychology. So these are excellent learning outcomes. What you guys are using best practice, which is not surprising because you are excellent at your craft, but you're using good verbs, and we'll talk about that in a minute because verbs are going to be really helpful when it comes to this alignment triangle. So as we think about what it is that we want our students to do, I want you to pay particular attention to the verb that you have used in your objective. What is it that you are truly asking them to know and be able to do? And then as we move along the triangle's axis down to assessment, we want to think about assessment as the methods and the tasks that we are using to detect or ascertain information about students' progress towards those learning outcomes. And so we typically think of assessment as being grouped into categories like projects or presentations, papers, exams, activities, portfolios, or products that students create in this way. And so the next question I have for you in the chat is to think about one of the favorite assessments that you give in one of your courses. So reflect for a minute on your favorite assessment and why in particular you like that assessment. And then when you're ready, you can share that in the chat. Great, I'm starting to see reflections coming in. So we have Melissa sharing that she uses a video submission. So having students actually create a Khan Academy style video to explain course content. Charisse talking about students getting to create a perceptual illusion presentation where they're going to experience the value of teaching something to someone else. Book presentation. So I'm starting to see a theme, like students engaging, students doing, right? They are crafting and creating something. Amanda's saying, let's have students present to hypothetical clients regarding the performance of a portfolio over the entire semester. Nursing lab practical exams, right? Identifying errors in technique. That's great. Going out to a fast food place and watching the interactions between the employee and the manager, and then using what they're learning in the classroom to kind of frame what they're seeing. I like it, Peggy. An excuse to get coffee, but it's awesome. Yeah. These are great, you guys. And what I'm loving about them is the focus that they have on what the student is doing. Across the board. So therein, your alignment is pretty positive already. You have a goal or an objective for the student, and then you're asking your students to do an assessment, a task, in this case, project presentation that allows them to demonstrate their knowledge. When we look across the bottom from assessment to instruction, that's another link that we want to make. And if I'm honest, this is the one that we always or seem to overlook the most. If we look at our institutional data from the learner perspective on instruction, where faculty development specialists come into a classroom and talk with students, one of the things that rises to the top is that students say there's frustration with what the exams look like. And sometimes that reflects back to the learning outcomes, but most of the time it reflects to what was done in class. So students will often say, we never did this in class. We never had an experience like this. And that indicates to us as instructors that there's a misalignment in these corners of the triangle. And so when you align your assessment to your instruction, the day-to-day activities that students are completing in your class actually help them reach the learning outcome. And if the learning outcome then is well aligned with the assessment, it also then helps them be ready for and able to be successful on whatever that final assessment is that you have for them. So this might be things like readings or discussions, which we could do in class. In a virtual environment, it would be like forum posts, could be things that you do in maybe a flipped classroom, like problem sets or reflections that students would do. And we are going to talk a lot more about the types of formative assessment that you can do within the context of instruction next week, because those pose their own unique challenges for a virtual learning environment. But today we're going to focus on the summative assessment, wherein you guys just gave some great examples of the types of things you would ask your students to do to create a summative assessment that really demonstrates their knowledge and understanding. So what I want to share with you today is just that one key you can kind of keep in mind when you're checking yourself for alignment is to ask yourself the question, what are the students doing? And if we're able to do that well with objectives, we're going to ask ourselves, what will the student know and be able to do? When it comes to assessment, we are going to ask ourselves about the kind of evidence we can gather from the student in terms of what they produce or do in the context of an assessment that helps us know how well the student was able to do it. And then when it comes to instruction, we are going to ask, what will the student do to interact with the content and build the necessary understanding and skills to achieve those learning outcomes? And earlier I had said, pay attention to the verbs. So here is where I want us to pause for a moment and do a little reflection. about the verb alignment. So I know many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy for learning. There are strengths and weaknesses to Bloom's, but it was originally developed in an assessment context. It was a way to give assessment designers a language to align the types of assessments that were being developed to the objectives that we had for the students. So this is a really easy way to check your alignment. If your objectives are for students to know, then your assessment should be about the knowledge level, the knowing, the who, what, when, where, why. If your objectives are about being able to analyze or critically think or evaluate, then your assessments should also be at that level. And judging by the learning outcomes that many of you shared at the beginning here, I would deduce that you have very high level objectives and assessments that are aligned in that process, because your assessments that you shared were ones that were asking students to synthesize and create and evaluate and apply. And those are at very high, kind of the top end, what we would call the higher order thinking skills from Bloom's taxonomy. And those then would align with the objectives that you have set forward for those learning experiences. So with that in mind, as we think about the assessment triangle and the alignment of the sides, it can be a little bit daunting, but it can also be freeing for us as we move to a virtual platform. And I say freeing because many of the challenges that we see with assessment can be overcome by looking at the alignment between the objective and the assessment. If the objective is really to have students apply, as Peggy had said, go out to a coffee shop, watch the interaction, and then apply your vocabulary to what you observed, you can do that in a virtual format. Now, the coffee shop may be a little bit hard to get to, but there are plenty of virtual coffee shop-like scenes from movies or clips that you could pull as an alternative to that assignment. But you could still align that main objective that you have for them with an assessment strategy where they're creating. I think the ones that we're drawn to, especially for me in the sciences, is our assessments are usually about knowledge, right? What do the students know? And our default way of assessing that knowledge is a multiple choice question, which is a very quick and easy way for us to ascertain data about what students know and don't know. It's very efficient, especially in larger classes. But the challenge is, in an open book context, those answers can be easily looked up. So how can we adjust that assessment strategy to still align with our objective, but also free us from some of the worries about cheating? And I'm just going to throw out one example, then we'll turn you over to the breakout rooms where you can think about this a little bit more deeply. But one example would be to potentially still give a multiple choice exam if that is well aligned with your learning objective, but instead of stopping it there, asking students to explain why they chose the answer they did. So they not only have to select the correct answer, which they could easily Google, but then they have to defend their choice. Why did I choose this? Why are the other answers incorrect? Now, some of that information may still be Googleable, but it's going to be harder for them to just quickly find that answer if they're being asked to justify their position or statement. So that's one example of how you might tweak an assessment practice that you're already doing to keep it aligned with your objective, but also transition it to a face-to-face format. Could also be freeing for you to think about assessment in many of the ways that you already are thinking about assessment, making those components where the students are creating something novel, they're evaluating something, the more weighted portion of your class grade, right? Maybe those are part of your class grade now, but maybe what you want to think about doing is upping the value of those experiences, keeping multiple choice, but decreasing the value of those to change the weighting within your classroom, because that may give you some freedom to assess student learning in this virtual or modified face-to-face format. So I have a couple of questions for you for your breakout sessions today. And for those of you who were here last time, Christine in a moment will kind of beam you out to a virtual breakout room, and then I will share in just a minute a link into the chat for a shared Google document. And in that Google document, you will see these questions up at the top, but then there's specific things for your groups to kind of take notes on as you go. Feel free to de-identify these. You don't need to list your class. You don't need to list your name, right? These are just kind of ideas for you, and we will be sharing these notes. So my hope is that during your breakout session, you'll be able to talk about what your learning objectives are and maybe what some of the verbs are that you tend to use the most in your objectives that would get you to thinking about your assessments. Reflecting a little bit on how you've assessed students in a face-to-face classroom and what verbs are associated with those assessments, and then how, going back up the triangle, how they're aligned with your objectives. And then what challenges do you foresee in the assessment of student learning in moving remote, and why do you see those challenges, especially in light of how your objectives and assessments align with each other? And then what ways could you consider assessing your students, maybe differently or tweaked in a certain way to meet this modified face-to-face formatting requirements that we're facing for fall? In, let's see, probably about 20 minutes or so, 20, 25 minutes, we'll come back together and we'll debrief some of the ideas and discussion that we have in these breakout sessions.
And just so everybody knows, Sarah's going to be putting into the chat the link to the Google document, the shared document that she was referencing. I'm going to wait to break you out into put you in the breakout rooms until the link has been shared, which it currently has been shared now. Anne has a great question, though, that I want to draw people's attention to. Is Bethel continuing to support Proctorio for remote proctoring of objective exams? Actually, I don't know the answer to that. Sarah, do you have a quick answer to that one before we send them off into their breakout rooms? If not, we'll make sure that we get you that information.
I believe that we are, and it looks like Charisse has said yes, they are. So I believe that option is still going to exist. I don't have it like from the higher ups, but okay, so it looks like it's still on a per student basis. So it won't be across the institution, but if you were somebody who was using it this year and still needs to, it looks like that option would still be available. But there are alternative ways in some cases to assess students that maybe wouldn't require Proctorio. In certain cases, that might be the best option, like for nursing, for example, where you're preparing your students for an NCLEX exam, but that may be an option that we can look at.
Okay, so with this, I'm going to be sending you into your breakout rooms, and again, follow the information that's provided on the Google document to know how to structure your conversation with one another. I'll be giving you a heads up and a countdown to know when we're going to be coming back into the main session, but you have approximately 20 minutes to be able to move through the items that Sarah has listed for you. Good luck, and we'll see you soon.
We're also going to stop recording at this point too, Christine, just to...
Perfect. That's great. Here we go. Herb, welcome. I'm going to assign you to a breakout room. Hold on just a sec. You are going to breakout room 3. I am now resuming recording. Just a little side note here, Sarah and I both want these experiences of being in Zoom to also be educational for you. So when you all were here to begin with, we started recording, and when you all went into your breakout rooms, I did not record, and now that you're all back, I'm recording again. And so all of our colleagues who weren't able to be with us synchronously here today will still be able to access the entire class period because I can upload it into Moodle at this point after this meeting today. So we highly recommend you use this tool for that purpose alone. All right, with that, Sarah, it's back to you.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add, I've just started to do a little digging in Zoom, but Zoom can close caption everything, and you can actually print the closed captions afterwards, so you have a transcript of your session as well if you don't want to post video for a variety of reasons. So there's some other options for us as a side note. But thank you for engaging in the discussion. What I'm going to kind of do here as we wrap up is use our Google document as a way to draw us into conversation. And so what I want to focus on is not necessarily the challenges. We talked a little bit about those beforehand, but want to bring to light some of the more innovative possible assessment approaches that you were talking through in your groups. So group 2, it looks like you guys focused in on Flipgrid a little bit, and I'd love it if somebody from your group would be willing to share with us the ideas that you have about Flipgrid and assessment.
I'll take that because it was me. I used Flipgrid for short answer responses in physiology exams. So I actually embedded Flipgrid links in their Moodle quizzes so that when they got to that question, there was a link that they could click over to Flipgrid, and then it would show the question and they had to give a video response. I encouraged them to spend time preparing their response so that they weren't trying to do it on the fly. And then they were always multi-part questions that didn't necessarily build off of each other, but all had to do with the same scenario. And they were able to express themselves that way. And I felt that even if they were cheating on it, even if they talked to someone else who took the exam earlier, because I did not do synchronous exams, that they still had to be able to synthesize and explain the material verbally. And it was usually pretty clear if they knew what they were talking about or they didn't. And even if they did try to mimic somebody else's response, my hope was that they at least learned something in that process because they had to then perform it themselves. And then I actually gave video responses to my students too, which I felt was faster than having to write. You can just click reply and I'd give a 30-second response. You got this right, this wrong. And many times the students responded that they really appreciated getting that little bit of face-to-face feedback, even if it was just me at 12:30 in the morning giving responses to them. So that was really beneficial. And one comment I made is that you can speed up the videos. So when you're grading and if everybody made a 4-minute video and I have 40 students, I had 4 video responses on my final. So 40 students times 4 videos times however long, but you can play them back at a faster speed.
Thanks, Melissa, for sharing your approach and then also your tip there for all of us with lots of students to watch. Let's see, group 3. You guys also talked about a video tool and talked about, you guys had some speaking and music components in your small group. And so I'd love to hear what you guys talked about in terms of products, right, that students create, either speaking or musical products that they are creating, and how you're thinking about assessing those. So who was in group, was that 3?
I'll jump you, or Paula, you want to respond?
Paula would be good.
Sure. We talked about the use of videos to have students submit their performances, whether it be in music or in speaking. And we brainstormed ways of giving effective feedback to those video submissions. So one of our members suggested an app called Video Ant, which is an annotation app for videos. It's a way to give very quick feedback. And so we provided a link in the Google Doc for people to access. We also talked about, like Melissa said, giving video-based feedback, or perhaps making a list of your feedback and then setting up a synchronous conversation with the students so that they can have the benefit of the spontaneity in a synchronous conversation, maybe asking some follow-up questions to improve their performance. And then we also brainstormed some ways that we could move from doing multiple choice tests to the creating of artifacts that then could be used as tools, like jigsaw activities, artifacts that the whole class then creates that could be used as tools for the students to then use and apply towards case studies or further higher level Bloom's learning.
Those are really creative ideas. Thanks for sharing the Video Ant tool. That looks really wonderful too, and could be very helpful if people are having students create more videos as well. And then Christine, did we just have 3 groups? Okay, so then group 6 was the last group, and I was a part of that one, but I'd prefer not to speak on behalf of the group that I was in. So I'll toss it to someone else in the group to share a little bit about maybe the idea of like what maybe Julie, you shared with regard to having students talk together in the context of exams.
Yeah, I had gotten this idea from another physics professor somewhere online, where final exam, this is when I used it just because I didn't think of it earlier. But basically what I was doing was putting the exams on Moodle as a quiz module. So there were some multiple choice, some little essay blocks, just short answer descriptions of something, then problems. And so what I did for the final was I also made a PDF like I normally would have handed them in the classroom. And so I posted that on Moodle earlier than the quiz opened. So before they could look at the, have access to making answers in Moodle, they could see the PDF. And I gave them basically 5 minutes for everybody to look at it. And I let them know this in advance. It wasn't a surprise in the moment. But they had 5 minutes to look at it, read it over quietly, individually, look through the whole exam. And then they had 15 minutes to talk about it however they wanted with each other. So I didn't put feedback into that time. I sat quietly and observed them, but they talked to each other. They kind of set up some groupings, like they decided this group is gonna talk through all the problems, and if you want to talk about multiple choice, go to this chat platform or something like that. And so they shared information with each other. They all it was good for the weaker students because if they had questions right away, they could ask the stronger students. There was a little bit of misinformation for some of the questions that came from some students about that. I just zipped my lip at it, but it was mostly okay. And I think I think it was a positive experience for them as kind of maybe a de-stress or just a good foundation for starting the exam.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, our group really talked about like how to play into the hand that students have, which is access to people and access to resources rather than fight it, and how we could creatively design assessments that almost require collaboration or require conversation with each other in order to create a product rather than try to remove those structures that they already have access to. For some of the assessments, obviously it doesn't apply to everything all the time, but when you look at the whole spectrum of assessment in your course, you would get some opportunities to kind of change up your instructional strategies for assessment. So I know that cuts our time. We are right at 2 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of your time, and I appreciate you all being here and contributing and sharing your ideas with everyone. Afterwards, we'll make the document available. You guys all have it, but we'll share it more broadly. If there's other things that you wish to add that you didn't get to have a conversation about, or questions that emerged after hearing what the other groups discussed about, feel free to add that into the Google document. We on our end and academic development's end will do the best that we can to support you in answering those questions. And then next week, we're really going to talk about the inside class assessment. So what we would call more formative assessment, and how to do that when we may not be able to see everyone's face or walk over and look at a student's work over their shoulder. And so we'll be having a similar kind of conversation next week about ideas and strategies for that. So if you have extra questions that you want to ask, feel free to stick around for a couple moments and ask myself or Christine those, but otherwise,